Veteran is humiliated by restaurant owner, unaware of who his son is. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. James Carter was a veteran whose life was a testament to resilience. He had served with distinction during the Gulf War, earning medals for bravery, but the battle scars, both physical and emotional, lingered long after the war ended. Now in his late 50s, James lived a quiet life in Boston, Massachusetts. He worked odd jobs to make ends meet, mostly keeping to himself and cherishing the rare moments he could spend with his son, Ethan. Ethan Carter, though proud of his father, rarely discussed James's military past. He was a self-made entrepreneur, rapidly building a tech company that was gaining attention nationwide. Ethan's life was a whirlwind of meetings, product launches, and networking events. Despite his busy schedule, he held a deep respect for his father, who had always taught him the values of perseverance and integrity. One chilly October evening, James was invited to a birthday dinner by his old friend and fellow veteran, Mike. The celebration was to be held at Reynolds Grill, one of the most popular restaurants in Boston. Known for its upscale ambience and pricey menu, the restaurant was owned by Martin Reynolds, a man whose reputation for being a shrewd businessman often overshadowed his penchant for belittling those he deemed unworthy. James arrived early, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and trousers that spoke of dignity despite their age. As he stepped into the opulent dining hall, his heart swelled with memories of camaraderie and shared struggles. Yet, the warm emotions were quickly replaced by discomfort when the maitre d', noticing James's modest attire, shot him a disdainful glance. "Excuse me, sir," the maitre d' began, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a private establishment. Are you sure you're in the right place?" James, taken aback, adjusted his stance. "I'm here for Mike Harrison's birthday dinner. I believe there's a reservation under his name." Before the maitre d' could respond, Martin Reynolds himself approached. Tall, impeccably dressed, and oozing self-importance, Martin assessed James with a smirk. "Oh yes, Mike's party," Martin said, his tone insincere. "We allow all sorts these days. Follow me, but don't hold up the line." Humiliated, James clenched his fists, swallowing the urge to retort. He quietly followed Martin to a table tucked away in the corner, feeling the stares of other diners. Throughout the evening, Martin made subtle jabs at James, referencing his outdated fashion sense and rough edges. Though his friends tried to lift his spirits, James couldn't shake the sting of humiliation. Unbeknownst to anyone, Ethan was present at the restaurant that night, seated across the room during a business meeting. His sharp eyes caught the interaction between Martin and his father. Though Ethan hadn't planned to greet James that evening, the sight of his father's quiet humiliation sparked a simmering anger that Ethan would carry out of the restaurant. As the evening ended, James left with a heavy heart. The memories of his service and sacrifices felt overshadowed by the sting of disrespect. Little did he know, this incident would ignite a chain of events that would change his life and the restaurant forever. The morning after the humiliating dinner, James tried to push the experience aside. He busied himself with routine chores and a long walk through the Boston Commons, the crisp autumn air offering some solace. Still, the echoes of Martin Reynolds' dismissive words lingered. James didn't want to tell Ethan about the incident. His son was already dealing with the pressures of running a growing business. But Ethan Carter hadn't forgotten what he saw. While James worked to bury his emotions, Ethan's mind was racing. He remembered the fire in his father's eyes that had dimmed under Martin's insults, and it ignited a deep sense of injustice. That morning, Ethan canceled his meetings and tasked his assistant with gathering information about Martin Reynolds and his restaurant empire. Ethan learned that Reynolds Grill wasn't just a local favorite. It was part of a larger chain owned entirely by Martin. The man had built his fortune on the promise of luxury and exclusivity, but there were whispers of unethical practices, unpaid overtime for staff, poor treatment of lower-level employees, and frequent firings for minor infractions. Digging deeper, Ethan uncovered something even more troubling. Martin Reynolds had a history of looking down on veterans, openly expressing disdain for their supposed lack of sophistication. The discovery enraged Ethan. His father, a man who had sacrificed so much for his country, deserved far better. For Ethan, this wasn't just about James, it was about standing up for every veteran Martin had disrespected. Meanwhile, James tried to move on, though the encounter had clearly left a mark. At a local coffee shop, he overheard a group of younger veterans sharing similar stories of being dismissed or patronized when trying to reintegrate into society. James listened in silence, but their words struck a chord. The camaraderie he'd felt during his service seemed so distant now. Ethan decided to take action. He visited Reynolds' Grill under the guise of considering an investment. His meeting with Martin was tense from the start. Martin, oblivious to Ethan's connection to James, treated him with the same arrogance he displayed toward others. "Mr. Carter, I run my business with precision and class," Martin said, leaning back in his chair. "It's not a place for, well, let's just say we cater to a more refined clientele." Ethan's jaw tightened. He maintained his composure but made a mental note of every slight. Leaving the restaurant, he felt more determined than ever to expose Martin's behavior and protect his father's dignity. At home, Ethan began drafting a plan. He contacted journalists and veteran advocacy groups, hinting at a story that could reveal the mistreatment veterans faced in certain high-end establishments. But this wasn't enough for Ethan. He wanted Martin to understand the gravity of his actions. Ethan approached James that evening, gently broaching the subject. "Dad, can we talk about what happened at the restaurant last night?" James hesitated, then sighed. "It was nothing, Ethan. Just someone showing their true colors. I've faced worse or not. It's unacceptable," Ethan replied firmly. "You don't deserve that." "None of you do." James studied his son, seeing the determination in his eyes. "What are you planning, Ethan?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Just trust me on this one, Dad." Though skeptical, James nodded. He had always trusted Ethan's instincts. What he didn't know was that his son was about to launch a campaign that would challenge the very foundations of Martin Reynolds' empire. Ethan's plan began taking shape over the next week. With his tech company's resources and connections, he orchestrated a quiet but calculated campaign to expose Martin Reynolds. His first move was to contact former employees of Reynolds' Grill. Ethan's assistant managed to track down several workers who had been fired or mistreated. Their stories painted a grim picture of the restaurant's internal culture: long hours, minimal pay, and a management style rooted in fear and intimidation. One former server recounted how Martin berated her for serving the wrong wine to a high-profile guest, dismissing her in front of the entire dining room. Another employee shared how Martin mocked a dishwasher who struggled with English, calling him replaceable, but the accounts that stung Ethan the most were those involving veterans. A former line cook who had served in Iraq described how Martin dismissed his service as glorified babysitting with guns. Ethan knew he had enough to go public, but he wanted his father's humiliation to lead to something transformative. He reached out to journalist Karen Blake, a respected investigative reporter known for her exposés on unethical business practices. Over coffee, Ethan laid out his findings and shared the details of his father's recent experience. Karen was intrigued. A man who disrespects veterans while building an empire on their backs. That's a story people will want to hear. But Ethan, are you sure you want to involve your father? This will bring a lot of attention to him. Ethan hesitated. He knew how private James was, but this wasn't just about his father. It was about holding Martin accountable. "I'll talk to my dad," Ethan said. But this needs to come out. While Ethan worked behind the scenes, James noticed something was off. Ethan was visiting more often, asking probing questions about his time in the military and his thoughts on societal respect for veterans. Though James appreciated the interest, he sensed there was more to it. "Ethan," James finally said one evening, "what are you up to?" Caught off guard, Ethan paused before responding. "Dad, what happened at the restaurant, it's not right. I can't let it go. I've been gathering stories about Martin Reynolds and how he treats people. Veterans like you too. I want to make sure he's held accountable." James frowned. "Ethan, I don't want my name dragged into anything. I've had my share of battles. I'm not looking for another one." Ethan placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "This isn't just about you, Dad. It's about standing up for everyone he's wronged. But I promise I'll only go forward if you're okay with it." James sat silently for a moment, his thoughts a mix of pride and apprehension. "Do what you think is right, Ethan. Just be careful." With his father's reluctant blessing, Ethan pressed forward. He provided Karen Blake with all the evidence and connected her with the former employees. Meanwhile, he discreetly arranged a public dinner at Reynolds Grill under the guise of a company celebration, inviting several influential figures, including veterans organizations and local politicians. On the day of the dinner, the atmosphere at Reynolds Grill buzzed with energy. Martin Reynolds, oblivious to Ethan's true motives, greeted the prominent guests with his usual pomp. However, he was unprepared for what would happen next. Halfway through the evening, Karen Blake entered the restaurant with her camera crew. Martin's smile faltered as she approached his table. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, "I'd like to ask you about allegations of mistreatment toward your staff, particularly veterans." The room fell silent. Guests turned to watch as Karen began listing accusations, citing former employees and the specific incidents Ethan had uncovered. Martin's face turned red as he stammered denials. Ethan stood from his seat and spoke calmly but firmly. "Perhaps you'd like to address how you treated James Carter, a decorated veteran who happens to be my father." Martin's eyes widened in shock. The room erupted into murmurs. Ethan walked to the center of the room, locking eyes with Martin. "You humiliated a man who served this country with honor. It's time you face the consequences of your actions." The guests, now aware of Martin's behavior, looked on with judgment and disdain. For the first time, the powerful owner of Reynolds Grill found himself powerless. The confrontation at Reynolds Grill sent shockwaves through Boston's elite. Karen Blake's team recorded everything, ensuring Martin Reynolds couldn't quietly brush the incident aside. By the next morning, clips of the confrontation flooded social media, accompanied by hashtags like #RespectOurVeterans and #JusticeForJames. The response was overwhelming. Veterans from across the city and the country shared their own stories of humiliation and mistreatment, turning Martin Reynolds into a symbol of corporate arrogance. His business faced immediate backlash, with patrons canceling reservations and suppliers reconsidering partnerships. Sponsors for his restaurant chain began pulling out, unwilling to associate with his tainted reputation. Amid the growing uproar, James Carter was thrust into the spotlight, much to his discomfort. Journalists showed up at his modest apartment, eager to interview the man at the center of the controversy. James, ever the humble soldier, refused to comment. "This isn't about me," he told them. "It's about treating people with dignity, no matter who they are." Ethan, however, knew that his father's story deserved to be heard. With James's hesitant approval, Ethan arranged for a controlled interview with Karen Blake. During the conversation, James recounted his life's journey, the trials of war, the struggles of reintegration, and the quiet pride he took in his son's success. His words resonated deeply with viewers, humanizing the faceless struggles many veterans endure. "I never wanted recognition," James said, "but I did hope that the sacrifices we made would mean something. That we'd be seen as people, not as reminders of a past people would rather forget." The interview struck a nerve. Public outrage against Martin Reynolds grew, but so did an outpouring of support for James and other veterans. Donations poured into local veteran organizations, and several businesses reached out to offer James discounts, employment opportunities, and public gratitude. Meanwhile, Martin Reynolds was scrambling to contain the fallout. His lawyers issued statements claiming the allegations were exaggerated, and he attempted to distance himself from the day-to-day operations of his restaurants. But the damage was done. Karen Blake's expose aired the following week, featuring interviews with former employees, veterans groups, and clips from the infamous dinner confrontation. In the expose, Karen underscored the disconnect between Martin's luxurious lifestyle and his callous treatment of employees. She ended the segment with a poignant clip of James Carter, staring into the camera with quiet determination. "It's not about me," he said again. "It's about doing what's right, even when no one's watching." As Martin's empire crumbled, Ethan was ready for his next move. He arranged a press conference at the same restaurant where his father had been humiliated. The dining hall was filled with journalists, veterans, and curious onlookers. Taking the podium, Ethan spoke with a blend of poise and conviction. "My father is the bravest man I know. He taught me that true success is measured not by wealth or status, but by the impact we have on others." Martin Reynolds built his fortune on exclusion and disrespect. "Today, we start something new, something built on the values my father instilled in me." Ethan paused before continuing. "I've purchased the rights to this restaurant and the others in Martin's chain. They will no longer bear his name or legacy." Gasps filled the room. James, sitting in the audience, looked at his son with a mix of pride and disbelief. "I've decided to rename this place the Valor Grill," Ethan announced, "dedicated to honoring our veterans and providing meals for those in need. We will ensure that no one who walks through these doors is treated with anything less than respect." The crowd erupted in applause, with several veterans standing to salute Ethan. Martin Reynolds, watching from afar, realized he had lost more than just his business. He had lost his reputation and his place in a community that now celebrated the very people he had dismissed. As the press conference concluded, James approached Ethan, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do all this for me, son," Ethan smiled, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "I didn't just do it for you, Dad. I did it because you taught me to stand up for what's right. This is your legacy as much as it is mine." The transformation of Reynolds Grill into the Valor Grill was swift and profound. Ethan spared no expense in remodeling the restaurant, stripping away its cold, exclusive atmosphere and replacing it with warmth and inclusivity. Photographs of veterans, both past and present, adorned the walls, alongside quotes celebrating courage and resilience. A section of the menu was reserved for pay it forward meals, dishes that customers could prepare for those in need. James Carter became an integral part of the project, though he initially resisted the attention. "I'm not a hero," he insisted to Ethan. But his son wouldn't hear of it. "Dad, your story is the reason people believe in this place. You don't have to be in the spotlight, but your voice matters." With Ethan's encouragement, James agreed to serve as a liaison between the Valor Grill and local veteran organizations. He helped establish a program where unemployed veterans could find training and work in the restaurant, gaining skills and confidence to reintegrate into civilian life. Opening night was a community event like no other. A line of patrons stretched down the block, each person eager to support the restaurant and its mission. Veterans from all branches of service attended, some in uniform, others in everyday clothing, but all sharing a bond of camaraderie. The local media covered the event extensively, and Karen Blake was among the honored guests. As the ribbon was cut, James and Ethan stood side by side. Ethan handed his father the scissors, insisting he do the honors. "This is your moment, Dad," Ethan said. James hesitated, then stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "This place isn't about me," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "It's about every man and woman who's put on a uniform and served with honor. It's about respect, dignity, and remembering that we're all human, no matter our station in life. Thank you for helping us build something that honors those values." With a swift motion, James cut the ribbon and the crowd erupted into cheers. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with activity, the smell of hearty meals filling the air. Guests mingled, shared stories, and raised glasses in honor of James, Ethan, and the broader veteran community. Meanwhile, Martin Reynolds watched the event unfold from a television in his lavish but now quiet home. His restaurant empire had crumbled, leaving him a pariah in the city. For the first time, he felt the sting of exclusion he had so often inflicted on others. Months passed, and the Valor Grill flourished. Ethan expanded the concept, opening new locations in underserved communities, always keeping the mission of honoring veterans and helping the needy at the forefront. James, now a well-known figure in Boston, found a renewed sense of purpose. His once quiet life was now filled with speaking engagements and volunteer work, but he remained humble, always crediting others for the restaurant's success. One afternoon, James received an unexpected visitor. It was a young man in military fatigues, holding a photograph of his family. "Mr. Carter," the man said, "I wanted to thank you. I was lost after leaving the service. Working at the Valor Grill gave me a second chance. Because of you, I'm back on my feet, and I just got my first civilian job offer." James smiled warmly and shook the man's hand. "You're the reason this place exists. You're what it's all about. Double quotes. As the man left, James looked around the bustling restaurant. Families dined together, veterans exchanged stories, and staff worked with a sense of pride. Ethan entered, catching his father's thoughtful expression. "Everything okay, Dad?" Ethan asked, sliding into a chair beside him. James nodded, a rare smile lighting up his face. "It's more than okay. This is more than I ever imagined." Ethan patted his father on the back. "None of this would have happened without you, Dad. You showed me what it means to stand up for what's right. Double quotes. As the evening wore on, James and Ethan shared a quiet meal together, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background. For James, it was a reminder that even in the face of humiliation, dignity and compassion could prevail. And for Ethan, it was proof that honoring his father's legacy had not only healed wounds, but had also built a brighter future for countless others. Together, father and son had turned an act of disrespect into a beacon of hope, proving that even the smallest gestures of kindness could ripple into something extraordinary.